Well, we've got Joseph. Oh, there we go. Thanks. We've got Joseph all involved in a great plot for a soap opera. But anyway, when we get to after the 2 whole years and Pharaoh has his dreams and Joseph interprets the dreams, we've got, I'll just pick up at the 14th verse of 41st chapter and refresh our memories. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. Hurriedly brought out of the dungeon, but not hurriedly taken to Pharaoh, because it says, when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes. Now we wonder, where did he get clothes? Because he's been, in prison. But anyway, he came in before Pharaoh, all clean and sweet-smelling. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had this dream. And he talks about the cows that came up out of the river, and some of them are fat and sleek, and and they fed on the reed grass, and then 7 other cows then come up, and they're very poor and ugly and thin, and then the skinny cows eat the fat cows. And then he has this other dream about ears of grain, full and good, growing on one stalk, and 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouting after them. And then those ears swallow up the good ears. And then he told it to the magicians, and no one could explain it to me, he says. And then Joseph says to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. And that's an interesting concept, that God is revealing something important to Pharaoh. Why is God bothering with Pharaoh? Pharaoh and the Egyptians are not the chosen people. But anyway, that's what Joseph tells him. And then he explains 7 good cows are equal years. The number of cows equal the years, and the number of ears of grain are numbers of years. And we don't add the 2 together. It's a repeating dream with the same concept. So we're only talking about 7 years of famine, not 14 in the calculations. So anyway, he says there will be 7 years of great plenty throughout the land of Egypt. And after them, there will rise 7 years of famine. And all of the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will consume the land. The plenty will no longer be known in the land because of the famine that will follow it, for it will be very grievous. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now therefore let Pharaoh, and here he goes from interpreting to giving advice. Goes right after, and God will shortly bring it about. Next verse, now therefore let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and lay them up under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine, that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Well, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants, and Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find anyone else like this, one in whom the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all of this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you." So here we hear Pharaoh picking up on Joseph's advice that he ought to find someone wise and discerning, and then Pharaoh repeats that criteria and then says, "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand and arrayed him with garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in a chariot of his second in command. And they cried out in front of him, "Bow the knee," or be attentive, or that they're not sure what that call meant. The translations, they argue about it. But anyway, it's telling people either to bow down or pay attention or get out of the way, he's coming. Some sort of important word that is distinguishing him as a very important personage in their midst. Anyway, moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up a hand or foot in all of Egypt." So he gives him ultimate authority except over Pharaoh himself. And then he gives him a name, Zaphenath Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as his wife. And thus Joseph gained authority over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And one of the commentaries mentions that if you calculate that, it was probably 13 years since he was accused by Potiphar's wife and thrown into the jail or the prison or the house arrest. So anyway, 13 years go by, and then he's elevated to this high status. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, and he went through all the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years of the earth, produced abundantly. He gathered up all the food in the 7 years, and then there was plenty in the land of Egypt, and he stored up food in the cities, and he stored it up in every city, the food from the fields around each city. So Joseph stored up the grain in such abundance, like sand of the sea, and he stopped measuring it because it was beyond measure. But before the years of the famine came, Joseph had 2 sons, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for, and he gives this interpretation of the name, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." So he forgets his hardship here and forgets about his mean brothers who sold him into slavery, essentially, when he forgets all my father's house. And then the second son he names Ephraim, "For God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortune." The 7 years of plenty that prevailed in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said. And there was a famine in every country, but throughout the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. So this doublet seems to be a contradiction. There was famine in every country, but throughout the land of Egypt there was bread. And then the next sentence seems to contradict that. When the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. So here again we have the weaving of 2 different stories together with these doublet that are saying kind of the same thing, but then there's a difference. They're not harmonized. So, anyway, yeah. Well, we're told that it wasn't a usual crop. It was 7 years of abundance, of plenty. Now, how do you measure the difference between normal and plenty? But he takes, if you think of it, 1/5. I mean, a lot of people whine and complain about being asked to tithe 1/10. 1/5 is 20%, is double that. So anyway, it's a significant ingathering to be stored. But we get to this point of since the famine spread over all the land, Joseph opened the storehouses, and one version says he rationed. But this says he sold it to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine became severe throughout the world. So, a lot of interesting points there, and it's kind of hard to cover them all at once, but we will begin with Professor Vaughter's commentary, and he points out these details to back up about the getting cleaned up to go before Pharaoh. Joseph most likely shaved whatever beard that he had grown in prison. And if y'all remember movies where they show pharaohs, their heads are shaved too. They want to be hairless. And when they have reliefs where they've done sculptures of people. Remember, most folks in these times were illiterate, so as they communicated their propaganda on public buildings, they would depict themselves as the victors and powerful and strong over others. And so they tried to depict others in embarrassing and humiliating positions. As remember, I've mentioned the Romans would picture the defeated barbarians. They would make the barbarian soldiers females. They're sissy little girly guys, was what they were trying to say with a put down. But in Egypt, the barbarians in their reliefs, or the serfs, would have a lot of hair. They'd have beards and long hair. And since that was not valued by the Pharaoh and the upper class, that was to make them look bad. So he gets cleaned up and shaves in order to be presentable. Vaughter suggests that by the time Joseph hears Pharaoh's dreams, Pharaoh had had great fun telling his story and stumping his dream interpreters. It had become kind of a game for him because he elaborates. I didn't read it all, but when Joseph is listening, the story is embellished a little bit. It's a little more, a few more words to it than when we first have it reported. Anyway, then he points out the question of numbers. It's curious, why 7? Yes, sir. Well, yeah, numbers have symbols, and so it can mean that, and but we're not positive because it could symbolize different things. But it can also mean completeness in the sense of that's a sacred number. It's a holy number. And in that sense, it would mean that number means God is involved here. God is in control of this time. And so, which would mean that the aplenty and the famine time might have been longer. But they used the 7 to indicate God was in control of this. This was a God thing in the telling of the story, and just using the number 7 would indicate that without having to say the sentence that God is in control here. Anyway, so we have the numbers stand for years. In the other dreams, with the cupbearer, the numbers stood for days, but this is numbers stand for years. But anyway, we understand the abundant crops in Egypt depended upon the Nile's flooding and spreading the silt over the land that would then enrich the land. And it's kind of like those of you who garden and you have a compost pile. You mix your compost into your garden in the spring before you start to enrich the soil. And if you don't, each year the plants are smaller and smaller and don't produce such big fruit. Which reminds me of a time when I was first sent to St. Stephen's United Methodist Church, and the parsonage had a backyard that was really hard black gumbo clay, and I wanted to have a garden, and I had some strawberries, and I just made this like square yard beside the fence, and I dug it up and I planted some strawberries. Well, you know what strawberries do. They send out these runners. And so I thought, well, I got to have a place for these runners to go. I'll extend the garden. But this soil is awful. And they were building new houses close to us. And, you know, when they build new houses and they're putting brick veneer on them, they come in and they dump a big load of sand in the front yard and they mix the mortar with the sand and so forth. So there's all this leftover sand. So I borrowed a friend's pickup truck, a member of the church that had horses, and I got a load of horse manure, and then I got a load of sand, and I mixed the horse manure and the sand into this gumbo clay and made another couple of square yards. Well, the next year, the original spot, the strawberry plant leaves were, you know, they have like 3 leaves. They were like my thumb. Where I had enriched the soil, the leaves were like my hands. And the strawberries were big, and then the strawberries were tiny. Only thing is, these tiny ones were sweeter than the bigger ones. So, which was better? But anyway, it was a dramatic difference between the enriched soil and just the black gumbo soil, hard packed and so forth. So that's kind of the difference in the abundance. They must have had some flooding, the normal flooding, but it must have brought really rich richness to the soil for the crops of those years. But then there are 7 years without flooding and renewal. So the soil is, I guess, pretty sandy, and therefore everything kind of washes through and washes out pretty quickly. So they need this enrichment, or the crops don't do well at all. So, anyway, so without flooding for 7 years or longer, the crops would diminish and diminish until they would hardly produce at all. Vaughter tells us that there is a stone inscription on an island called Siheil that's near the first cataract of the Nile, and there's an inscription recorded on it that mentions a period of 7 years when there was no overflow of the Nile, and the inscription dates that when it was inscribed, it was about 200 BC or before BCE, before the Common Era, but it is reporting an ancient happening around 2800 BC or before BCE, before the Common Era. And the point he makes is that a famine was conceivable in their minds. They knew it was possible. Rare, but possible to happen. And it also gives some historical verification that indeed there was a great famine in the land in the ancient times. The 7 years may not have been literal, as I said. It may have been just a number. But the inscription says 7, so the tradition had kind of picked up that number and passed it on in the oral tradition until it got chiseled in stone. Let's see. Vaughter points out to us that there are two sources of the Yahwist version, and it's kind of well, I won't go through, but it's interesting to he prints in his book the Yahwist one in one type of print, and then the Elohist version in a different kind of print. And if you just read one, as I've done before, you get the story. You know, there's no big gap. You get the basic story, but the details and the feeling are different. But the basic plot line is carried in each version, but you get an entirely different perspective in the way. But I just read all that, and I won't go back and read it again. But the Yahweh source and the Elohist source, the redactor brings them together in this final edition of Genesis, and they're woven together. But there does seem to be two different positions that Joseph assumed in his high Egyptian office. One office is to be the overseer of all the operations of storing grain throughout the land in each of the cities, gathering the crops from around their area in the cities instead of bringing it all and shipping it and having one great big pyramid of grain in one place. But that meant overseers. And that was part of one of the lines in there that Pharaoh would designate overseers in the cities to do this. But that meant that there would be one main overseer of all the other overseers. And that is the Yahwist view of Joseph's job. It carries with it a sense of enforcing and exacting the tax, this 1/5. That they would gather from the people. I mean, a lot of people are going to say, yeah, sure. I mean, we've got, don't know how you feel about it, but we've got, 97% of the scientists or more say global warming is real. It's happening. And we need to take steps to do something about it. And then we have the deniers that say it's a hoax, it's not happening. So, and the big reason they're saying that is because there would have to be steps that would require sacrifices and changes to prepare for the problems. Well, we don't want to do that. You can't prove it to us, so we're not going to take those steps. And so that's what Joseph would have encountered. You're lying. This isn't true. How can we believe you? The Nile floods all the time. There's not going to be a famine. We don't have to give you 1/5 of our produce. We're going to keep it for ourselves. So there has to be some kind of authority that says, for the general good, yes, you must do this. This must happen. So you appoint overseers and you appoint someone to administer this. And that's one of the roles. But in the Alois version, which uses the words wise and discerning man that Joseph recommends, and Pharaoh describes Joseph as a man so endowed with the Spirit of God that no one can be as wise and discerning as you. You shall be in charge of my palace. Not the whole land. You'll just be in charge of my palace. But the charge in the palace rings similar to the theme of in Potiphar's house. He comes in as a house slave, does well. I will put you in charge of my house and my business around the house. And then Potiphar's wife accuses him of inappropriate behavior. He's thrown in the prison or house arrest. And the jailer recognizes he has the skills and abilities. I will put you in charge of my prison house. And then he interprets the dreams. Pharaoh says, you're so wise and discerning, I will put you in charge of my palace. The other version is the viceroy over all the land. Now, these offices, as they study the history of Egypt, they found that there were such officers in Egypt, and occasionally one person could hold both offices. If you think Joseph has to oversee the whole place, and he's given this chariot, the second in command, to be able to go around and show the authority of the Pharaoh to enforce the tax laws and the gathering and the storing and so forth, that's what he would be doing. But he would come home sometime. Where would he office? Well, he'd office in the palace. You know, the palace has all these extra rooms and so forth, and all these servants and managers and so forth. So the two could happen, but again, it's two different stories coming along. We also notice that the high priest, whose daughter Joseph marries, is a Potipharah. Sound familiar? Again, they're saying that Potiphar is a name that is closely connected with Joseph, but in the different oral traditions, that connection had two different paths. So that in one, Potipharah is the high priest whose daughter Joseph marries. In the other story, Potiphar is the guy who becomes Joseph's first master. Now, in the telling of the stories, all of those things could have happened, but as they interconnected, they might have, grabbed a name one from the other and attached it. We don't know because the oral tradition is hard to trace. But anyway, those are, again, evidences of different traditions coming together with a redactor telling the story. Let's see. If we stop and think about this administrative job or office, that Joseph would have, he would need to be in the field quite often to check on things, because we know that if you're exacting taxes and you're gathering from people, there could be all kinds of sweet deals and embezzlement, or all kinds of things going on with this process. So there would need to be a very honest, good supervisor to make sure it was working. And the guy who fully understood the need and the problem and had come up with a plan, it's usually better for that person who conceives of the plan and fully understands it to try to carry it out. Have you ever tried to come up with a good plan and then you delegate it to somebody and then they go off and do it all wrong because they didn't get the concept, they didn't understand, or they didn't understand the importance of some part of it? They thought, that doesn't matter. Yes, it does. That's the main idea. How could you throw the main idea away? Now you've messed it all up. Anyway, anybody had that experience? So we go through these situations here. Now, the role of the high office lasted a long period because Joseph stayed in the land. So he would have been at least 14 years of plenty and 14 years of famine before things turned around. But if it was longer than that, but he's also, we know, in the land when his brothers come down to buy grain, and then he brings his father and they settle there. And there's no indication that Joseph ever retires from office. So it's just kind of he stays there, we assume. Anyway, it also seems that Pharaoh intended to set Joseph up for the long run. He wants to keep him fully integrated into Egyptian culture and society, and not only gives him this high title, but he gives him the robes and the signet ring, and then he arranges this marriage that a very high-profile young woman in the culture, the high priest's daughter, and that is well-connected kind of situation. He reminds us that this high priest was probably high priest of the sun god, who is a very important god in Egyptian culture. And so we run into the problem that we have that's back and forth, the patriarchs or the leaders who marry outside the family, outside the faith. And in some places this is a terrible thing, but here it happens and no big deal is made out of it. Now, we can assume if he has to come home to the palace and he's in this high culture area of the society and is married to the high priest's daughter, that all the socializing is in this upper level. And so he is highly integrated and influenced. He doesn't go off to a very humble, private kind of life. He's deeply embedded in the culture of the highest level of the society. So we find from one perspective that he's thoroughly sold out. He would be corrupted. How does he keep his faith in the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the fathers. How does he do that if he's so closely connected? Well, on the one hand, all of that religion hadn't developed yet. We hadn't gotten to Moses and the Ten Commandments and the establishment of the priesthood and so forth. He's not breaking any laws at this point, but he is setting an example. And it creates problems when the big shots marry outside the faith, and then you tell all the common folks you can't do that. Well, if they know the story, they'll say, well, what about Joseph? But anyway, that's something that is kind of not dealt with here. Now, he has the sons, and he gives these names, which is also saying that he has pretty well fully gotten past all the bad stuff, and now he's in the good times. But the very expression of those names carry a level of sadness with them. The names remind him of the sadness that he once had, and now he's past it. And in one sense, he is fully integrated into the culture, and doesn't have any desire now to get away and go back and be rejoined to his family. Let's see. I've already covered that idea. On this section, Professor Von Rod gives us some other interesting information, and I'll kind of back up and go over some of these. He points out the significance of the cows in Pharaoh's dream. Cows were supposed to be sacred to the goddess Hathor, Hathor, and were symbolic of fertility. Now, fertility is important when we're talking about famine and abundance, and so it's interesting that then cows are the symbols that are involved in the dream. But another part of that, they call them, calls them water cows. Now the water cows, they come up out of the Nile. Now we see cattle around here all the time, and occasionally we see them in the pond, but they don't live in the pond. What could this mean? Could the water cows be hippopotami? They have hippopotami in the Nile. So maybe we need to change our image. They aren't Herefords or Black Angus or Brahmas or Holsteins. They're hippopotami, possibly. And they do get fat and sleek. I'm having trouble creating an image of a skinny, sickly hippopotamus. It just doesn't quite compute. But anyway, that's something that Von Rod points out to us. Anyway, but the fact that these herbivores, they come out of the Nile and they're eating the reeds, but then the skinny ones eat the fat ones, which would make them carnivores, and then ears of grain don't eat other ears of grain. They don't eat. So he points out that the eating part is a part of the fantasy aspect of dream. And he also points out how when Joseph goes very smoothly and directly from interpreting the dream right into suggesting a practical plan for dealing with the meaning of the dream, Von Rad points out that this final author, the redactor, would be writing in the time of the exile, and there would have been already in existence at that time the wisdom tradition and the resources of the Proverbs, and that Solomon and all of his many wives and all of the children created the need for a school for the princes, not princesses, but princes, to teach them in statecraft how to be wise, how to rule well, how to talk on their feet, how to exercise leadership skills. And in those verses in Proverbs were many instructions for young men to be able to speak publicly and in a significant situation to be able to offer wise counsel should they be asked to do so, and to use wisdom to do that. And so Von Rad suggests that in Egypt, the storing of the grain in the public granaries was a very wise example of Joseph exercising the education that a young prince would have gotten at this time. So he's demonstrating these qualities of training in the way he cleans himself up, he speaks eloquently, and not only interprets the dream, but then goes right from there to giving advice and wise counsel to his superior. And that's a part of the schooling in this statecraft that the young princes would have gotten. And so that would have already been in their history, and so he was illustrating that Joseph has these qualities as he describes it in the story. Another thing Von Rad suggests is that in Egypt, storing grain in public granaries was a practice of government. Now, we're not sure whether that may have gotten started with Joseph and continued thereafter, or it was already somewhat in place, and he used the idea that we need to maximize this policy and not just do it in a few isolated places, but throughout the land, around in all of the cities. So whether Joseph grabbed this idea that already existed and used it for the grand plan, or maybe it's just evidence of what he might have done if the historicity of this is played out, that it may have been a vestige of Joseph's influence that carried on. Von Rad doesn't go into any detail one way or the other. He just says that this existed in Egypt. So he also points out that Joseph seems to have become completely Egyptianized in this high office with the fine robes and marrying the priest's daughter and socializing at the highest level and so forth, and then interpreting his sons' names and all as a way of fully integrating. But then that storyline, he says, immediately turns to the transition from the plenty to the famine, which will soon bring Joseph back into contact with his family. It says, the one sense, I've forgotten that, I'm past that, I'm done with them, I'm fully integrated here, I'm happy, and then very shortly that gets reversed. And so that again is a part of the good storytelling of the ancient writers, because they're going to, you all watch any of these CSIs and all these crime scene and murder mystery stories, and or reading those kind of novels, that the biggest thing that gets you, that they get you believing it's going this way and that way, and all of a sudden, nope, not that. Boom, here's a surprise. It's something you weren't expecting. Well, that's kind of what's happening here. He's fully integrated. He's over all that, and he's done with them. And then, whoops, surprise, here they come. They're right here, right at your feet. Anyway, so another part that is interesting here, that when the famine comes, it's not simply in Egypt, but it's the whole region, and all of the neighbors are suffering the famine as well. And then the last line, moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain, because the famine was severe all over the earth. So they're telling us it's worldwide. Now, of course, we realize the people in these times had no idea of how big the earth was, and there were oceans and other lands on the other side of the ocean and so forth. But they did know the extent of their regions, because the different caravans that would trade and come and tell stories about. And so they did know that their known world, which was quite extensive, was all experiencing the famine. Now, I noticed something that neither Vodder nor Von Rad commented on, and our RSV and Von Rad's translation states that when the famine came, all the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, meaning grain to make their bread. And Pharaoh says, go to Joseph, and Joseph opens up the storehouses. And I mentioned before, he sold it to the Egyptians. And Vodder says Joseph opened the storehouses, and he uses the word rationed the grain to the Egyptians. Now, did Joseph sell the grain to the Egyptians? Or did he ration it out and just give back to them what they had given to him to store? It would be fair, we would think, to give it back. It was ours in the first place. However, we don't know how much he charged. Now, there would need to be some way to set up a distribution system. The grain's in storage in some place. You bring out a little bit at a time. You put it in some kind of little bags or sacks, or have a measuring cup, and you have someone to do that. And you have guards that guard the grain at night to keep people from sneaking in and stealing it, either for themselves or to work in a black market and sell and so forth. So there would have been administrative costs. And so the selling might have been to take care of the administrative costs, and might not have been exorbitant. Now, the other part, it may have been that if they were overcharging and it was abusive, then we might read about food riots in the cities. But we're not hearing about that. So we might assume that this was just an administrative cost that they were charged for the grain. However, it seems like a big financial boon to the government or the Pharaoh gathers in 1/5 for 7 years and then sells it back for a fee. And so that would be a massive accumulation of wealth. And when we know that wealth equals power and power corrupts, then this may have led to the possibility of some people not having the money to buy the bread, and so they might sell a son or a daughter into slavery so they can keep the rest of the family alive. And this sort of thing is happening now with the trafficking situations. One might sell themselves, and all of a sudden now, through the famine, somebody has acquired a whole lot of serfs that have enslaved themselves, given themselves in order to stay alive. And then with that, well, we've got all these slaves, what are we going to do with them? Well, let's have building projects. We've got all this money, we've got all this free labor, let's start doing that. And all these people have migrated down here for the grain. Well, look, they're getting old, they're having all these babies, and there's so many of them. Let's just enslave them and do our building projects. And now we got a situation where God has to send Moses to let my people go. So, the good news and the bad news and how cycles go, this all may be part of a bigger story that's evolving here. Anybody ever think of that? Well, anyway, all these things are the greater story that some people could make a movie out of it. And it raises another question about this accumulation of wealth in the house of Pharaoh, because Joseph's management skills with this wealth, it does bring this power, and at some point Joseph is a part of all of that, and obviously he didn't live long enough to be present, and we get to the point where at one point they say the Pharaoh had forgotten about Joseph and Joseph's family and his people, and so then the Pharaoh decides to enslave them. But it may be a lesson of the unintended consequences. A lot of times good things happen for the right reasons, and it meets the problem or situation of one day, but then as time goes on, then we realize that some of those things weren't so good. You can think of a lot of the problems they're discovering now with dams. Dams seem like they're a great deal, get this big mass of water and so forth, and then the dam catches all this silt and stacks up. And then the problem with, the salmon have lost their runs to get back to their spawning grounds. And so nowadays there's a lot of eliminating dams in order to let the rivers flow more freely, and the whole ecology of a land and area needs to be restored, because the short-term benefits of the dam created long-term problems. So anyway, that's what we run into all kinds of places, and may have been the problem here. Joseph saved his family, provided the grain. They didn't die. They just settled, and then they become slaves later.